The wind howled like a hungry wolf through the skeletal frame of the old radio tower, a rust-red skeleton against a sky of churning gray. Snow, thick and wet, swirled in a dizzying dance, clinging to the pines of whispering peaks and muffling the world in a blanket of white. Down below, in the cramped, dusty control station at the tower's base, a former Signal Corps specialist named Caleb stood with his German Shepherd, Sarge. The dog, usually as stoic as the mountains themselves, was restless tonight. His ears were pinned back, and a low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound Caleb rarely heard from his faithful companion. It wasn't the storm that agitated him. Sarge had weathered far worse tempests in their time together on this isolated peak. His attention was fixed on a vintage shortwave radio on the desk, its speaker crackling with a storm-fueled static that was both chaotic and grating to human ears. The interference seemed random, born of the atmospheric chaos above, but Sarge's behavior suggested otherwise. Caleb reached to turn it off, to restore the quiet peace of their isolation. But Sarge stepped forward, placing a heavy paw on his boot and letting out a sharp, insistent bark. The command was clear. Listen. Caleb paused, his weathered hand hovering over the dial. And then he heard it. Beneath the wall of white noise, a pattern emerged. Faint, but deliberate. A rhythmic series of clicks and tones, too structured to be a fluke of the weather, too purposeful to be ignored. It was a signal, weak and buried, but undeniably there. Sarge's growl deepened, his intelligent brown eyes locked on the speaker, as if he understood the ghost in the machine, as if he sensed a danger that transcended the simple fury of the storm outside. Caleb felt a familiar switch flip in his mind, the old training kicking in like muscle memory. Curiosity, sharp and insistent, cut through the peaceful solitude he had so carefully cultivated in these mountains. The signal was calling to him, drawing him back into a world he thought he had left behind. Caleb had come to these remote mountains seeking silence, an escape from a world that had become too loud, too full of echoes from his time in the service. The small plot of land, crowned by its rusted junk radio tower, was an inheritance from a man he barely knew. His grandfather, Arthur. To the few residents of the nearby town, Arthur had been the local eccentric, a recluse who hoarded secrets and spoke more to the airwaves than to people. The townspeople remembered him as a strange figure, shuffling through the general store with his wild hair and suspicious eyes, muttering about frequencies and government conspiracies. For Caleb, the inheritance had been less a gift and more a convenient retreat, a place where the jagged peaks could stand guard over his solitude and where the ghosts of his past deployments couldn't follow. His life here was simple, measured by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing of the seasons, and the quiet companionship of Sarge. The dog was more than a pet. He was an anchor, a lifeline to sanity. In the dead of night, when the ghosts of past deployments would whisper at the edge of his consciousness, when the phantom sounds of mortars and screaming would drag him from sleep in a cold sweat, Sarge's warm, steady presence beside his bed was the one thing that could pull him back from the brink of despair. The shepherd seemed to understand the invisible wounds Caleb carried, offering a silent, unwavering loyalty that asked for nothing in return, except the occasional scratch behind the ears and a shared meal. Together, they had carved out a fragile peace in this forgotten corner of the world, surrounded by the hushed majesty of the forest and the silent judgment of the looming, forgotten tower. It was a life built on the deliberate exclusion of the outside world, a fortress of tranquility that, until this storm-swept night, had seemed impenetrable. But the signal crackling from the old radio was a voice from that world, a persistent whisper threatening to breach their carefully constructed defenses. Driven by a mix of professional instinct and trust in his dog's uncanny intuition, Caleb began to explore the dusty control station that had been his grandfather's sanctum. The air was thick with the smell of old paper, ozone, and time itself, a musty cocktail that spoke of decades of isolation. Cobwebs draped the corners like forgotten memories, and dust motes danced in the weak light that filtered through grimy windows. He ran a hand over a shelf, leaving a clean streak in a decade of accumulated grime, and pulled down a thick, leather-bound ledger that felt heavy with secrets. It was Arthur's journal, the pages yellowed and brittle with age. The leather cover was worn smooth by countless hands, and the binding creaked as he opened it. The pages were filled with his grandfather's tight, spidery handwriting, detailing decades of meticulous radio logs, atmospheric observations, and schematics for equipment that was now hopelessly obsolete. Charts tracked solar activity, weather patterns, and mysterious transmissions that seemed to come from nowhere. But woven between the technical data were more personal entries. Fragments of a story Caleb had never heard. Glimpses of a man far more complex than the town's dismissive characterization. Arthur wrote of the changing valley, of the slow creep of outside interests, of developers and politicians who saw the pristine wilderness as nothing more than profit waiting to be extracted. There was a deep, abiding distrust for the world beyond his mountain, a paranoia that seemed, as Caleb read further, to be rooted not in madness, but in bitter experience. Then, buried deep in the journal's pages, Caleb found it. An entry dated nearly 40 years prior, the handwriting shaky with an emotion that felt raw, even through the faded ink. It spoke of a profound betrayal, a broken promise by a man Arthur described as his closest friend, his brother, in all but blood. The words dripped with anguish and disbelief. He never wrote the man's name, referring to him only by a single, stark initial. T. This betrayal, the journal made clear, was the event that had shattered Arthur's life, turning him from a hopeful innovator into a suspicious recluse. It was the reason he had retreated to this mountain, using his tower not to connect with the world, but to watch it, to listen for the echoes of a promise broken and an enemy he never stopped monitoring. The coded signal was a puzzle, and for a man like Caleb, a puzzle was a welcome distraction from the endless quiet of mountain life. He spent the next day cleaning and recalibrating Arthur's old equipment, his trained hands moving with a forgotten familiarity that felt like coming home. The vintage gear was a far cry from the sophisticated digital systems he had once operated in distant theaters of war, but the principles were the same, the electromagnetic spectrum as constant as the mountains themselves. Vacuum tubes glowed amber in the dim light, and analog meters twitched with each adjustment. Sarge lay at his feet throughout the process, a silent, watchful guardian, occasionally lifting his head as if listening alongside his master, his ears swiveling to catch sounds beyond human perception. By late afternoon, Caleb had isolated the transmission, filtering out the storm's interference with techniques learned in smoky command posts half a world away. It was a simple numeric code, broadcast on a tight, repeating schedule that spoke of military precision. The numbers meant nothing to him at first, just a series of digits floating in the electronic ether, but their regularity suggested purpose, intention. As he jotted down the sequence on a piece of Arthur's old notepaper, a flicker of movement outside caught his eye. Through the frost-etched window, he saw a heavy-duty pickup truck, the logo for Thorn Logistics emblazoned on its door in bold, professional lettering, idling at the edge of his property line like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The driver was nothing more than a silhouette behind the reflective glass, but Caleb could feel the weight of observation, the uncomfortable sensation of being studied. The figure seemed to be staring directly at the tower, taking its measure, before the truck rumbled away, disappearing down the snow-covered track with deliberate slowness. A cold knot formed in Caleb's stomach, a familiar sensation from his days in hostile territory. Thorn. The name was prominent in the small valley below, a local success story who owned half the businesses in town, a man whose influence stretched into every corner of valley life, and it started with the letter T. Suddenly, the pieces clicked into place with a chilling certainty that made his blood run cold. This wasn't just a random radio transmission bleeding through the static. This was a message, a thread in a web that had been spun long before he arrived, a conflict that had been simmering for decades. He wasn't just an heir to a piece of land. He was the heir to a war, a silent struggle that his grandfather had fought from this very room until the day he died. To get answers, Caleb knew he had to venture down from his mountain sanctuary and into the world of people and their complicated relationships. He drove his old pickup truck into the small town of Whispering Peaks, the tires crunching on the salted road that wound between towering pines and snow-laden firs. The town, nestled in the valley like a scene from a Christmas card, looked picturesque and welcoming, but the atmosphere was as cold as the winter air that bit at his cheeks. Main Street was lined with quaint storefronts and businesses that bore the Thorn name or logo, a testament to one man's dominance over the local economy. As he walked into the general store, conversations died down like a radio being switched off. People eyed him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their gazes lingering on his weathered face and military bearing. He was Arthur's blood, the grandson of the crazy hermit. And in a town this small, legacies were worn like a second skin. Whispers followed in his wake, fragments of speculation about why he had come down from his mountain, what he wanted, whether he was as unstable as his grandfather had been. He was the keeper of the Junk Tower, the heir to the local madman's throne, and the weight of that reputation pressed down on him like the low-hanging clouds outside. Only one person offered a genuine smile, a beacon of warmth in the chilly reception. It was Alara, the town librarian and unofficial historian, a woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a passion for the valley's hidden stories that burned brighter than the wood stove in her domain. She had the look of someone who collected stories the way others collected stamps, and her smile suggested she had been waiting for him to walk through her door. Caleb, seeking information and finding unexpected kindness, made his way to the library, a warm, quiet haven smelling of aging wood, paper, and the indefinable comfort of accumulated knowledge. He asked her about his grandfather and about Marcus Thorn, watching her expression carefully. Alara's smile faded slightly, replaced by something more complex, a mixture of sadness and understanding. She led him to a dusty archive in the back, past shelves that reached toward the ceiling like towers of memory, and pulled out an old high school yearbook whose spine cracked with age. There, on a yellowed page that spoke of dreams and possibilities, were two young men, arms slung over each other's shoulders, beaming with youthful optimism and the confidence of those who believed they could change the world. One was a younger, brighter version of his grandfather, Arthur, his eyes clear and hopeful, unmarked by the disappointment that would later consume him. The other was a handsome, charismatic Marcus Thorn, his smile wide and genuine, the kind of person who drew others into his orbit like a magnet. They were inseparable, Alara said softly, her voice filled with a hint of sorrow for something lost long ago. Best friends, Trikey as some would say, two souls who understood each other completely. They were going to change the world together from that tower of yours, protect the valley from outside interests, preserve its natural beauty for future generations. Then one day, something happened. Something broke them apart completely. No one ever knew exactly what, but the friendship died, and Arthur retreated to his mountain while Marcus built his empire down here in the valley. The revelation that Arthur and Thorn were once best friends, brothers in all but blood, cast a new and more tragic light on the journal's cryptic entries. Back in the cold solitude of the radio station, surrounded by the ghosts of his grandfather's obsession, Caleb read for hours, the dim light of a kerosene lantern casting long, dancing shadows on the walls, covered with charts and photographs. The more he read, the clearer the picture became, a portrait of friendship transformed into bitter enmity. He now understood the deep well of pain behind his grandfather's words, the anguish of a man who had been betrayed by the person he trusted most in the world. He read about their shared discovery, detailed in Arthur's careful notes and sketched maps. A series of unexplored caves high on the mountain, hidden passages that led to chambers rich with unique geological formations, and, as Arthur's increasingly excited notes hinted, artifacts of a much older, forgotten history. Ancient petroglyphs covered the walls. Tools and pottery fragments lay scattered on cave floors, evidence of a Native American presence that predated any official archaeological record. They had made a pact, sealed with a handshake and the naive trust of young men, to protect the site together, to study it properly, to ensure that its secrets were preserved and respected, rather than exploited. But the journal then descended into a chronicle of deceit that made Caleb's jaw clench with anger. Thorn, driven by a greed that Arthur had failed to see beneath his friend's charming exterior, had gone behind his back like a thief in the night. He had secretly contacted outside investors, mining companies, and private collectors, offering to sell the location's mineral and artifact rights to the highest bidder. When Arthur confronted him with evidence of his betrayal, Thorn hadn't just denied it. He had launched a calculated campaign to destroy his former friend's credibility and reputation. Arthur wrote of doctored reports that made him appear unstable, of rumors spread through town about his growing paranoia, of business deals mysteriously falling through, and of being slowly but surely pushed to the fringes of the community he had loved and tried to protect. Thorn had used his natural charm and growing influence to paint Arthur as a paranoid, obsessive madman who saw conspiracies everywhere, a narrative the town had readily accepted because it was easier than confronting the truth about their golden boy. Caleb felt a surge of cold fury rise in his chest, a righteous anger that burned hotter than the wood stove in the corner. This wasn't just a business dispute over development rights. It was character assassination, a deep and personal betrayal that had stolen his grandfather's life, his reputation, his place in the community, and ultimately his spirit, leaving him alone on a mountain with nothing but his radios and his resentment for company. The crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor, the sound cutting through the winter silence like a warning. Caleb looked up from the journal, his hand instinctively moving closer to the heavy iron fireplace poker that leaned against the stone hearth. Years of military training had taught him to be suspicious of unexpected visitors, especially in remote locations. Sarge was already on his feet before Caleb had even registered the sound fully, a low, menacing growl vibrating through the floorboards and raising the hair on Caleb's arms. The dog's hackles were raised, his body rigid with tension, every muscle coiled like a spring ready to release. Through the frost-etched window, Caleb saw a pristine, expensive truck, far newer and more luxurious than the utility vehicle he'd seen before, its chrome gleaming even in the pale winter light. From it emerged a man who carried himself with an air of effortless authority, the kind of confidence that came from years of having doors opened and obstacles moved aside. It was Marcus Thorn, and seeing him in person after studying that old yearbook photo was like looking at a photograph that had been aged by time and ambition. He was older than in the yearbook, his hair a distinguished silver that spoke of wisdom and success, his face lined with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way in all things. He wore an expensive coat that probably cost more than most people in the valley made in a month, and his boots were the kind of practical luxury that suggested a man who could afford the best but wasn't afraid to get them dirty. He approached the cabin with a broad, disarming smile, raising a gloved hand in a friendly gesture that seemed calculated to put Caleb at ease. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and neighborly, the practiced tone of a politician or a salesman. "Caleb, right?" "I'm Marcus Thorn," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "I was a great friend of your grandfather's, back in the day. Just wanted to stop by and offer my condolences for your loss. Arthur was a unique man, and I know how difficult it must be to inherit all of this." He gestured vaguely at the tower and the surrounding property, with a dismissive wave that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and subtle disdain. This place, well, it holds some painful memories for all of us. I'd be happy to take this burden off your hands, give you a fair price for what is, let's be honest, pretty useless property. Help you make a fresh start somewhere more suitable for a young man like yourself. The words were laced with false sympathy, a performance of concern that made Caleb's skin crawl and his instinct scream danger. But it was Sarge's reaction that solidified his distrust and confirmed every suspicion the journal had planted in his mind. The dog moved to stand directly between Caleb and the door, his body becoming a living barrier, his intelligent eyes never leaving Thorne's face. The growl was no longer a low rumble. It was a clear, unambiguous threat, a sound that promised violence if this stranger took one step closer to his master. Sarge had met dozens of hikers, hunters, and locals over the years, greeting them with the typical German Shepherd wariness, but never showing an ounce of real aggression. Yet in the presence of this smooth-talking man with his expensive clothes and practiced smile, his protective instincts were screaming warnings that transcended human understanding. Caleb placed a calming hand on Sarge's massive head, feeling the tension in every muscle, but his eyes never left Thorne's face, studying it for tells and weaknesses. In that moment, he knew with absolute certainty that his grandfather had been right about this man. He trusted his dog's judgment more than any word that could come from this serpent's mouth, and Sarge was telling him everything he needed to know about Marcus Thorne's true nature, with Thorne's predatory offer echoing in his mind like a threat wrapped in silk. Caleb knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The enemy was too well connected, too deeply embedded in the community's power structure. He needed allies, information, and most importantly, he needed to understand exactly what he was up against. He drove his truck back down the winding mountain road to the library, the journal tucked safely inside his jacket like precious cargo, its weight a constant reminder of the truth his grandfather had died protecting. He found Ilara reshelving books in the history section, her movements efficient and purposeful, but there was a look of concern on her face, as if she'd been expecting him, as if she'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. When she saw him enter, her expression shifted to one of worry mixed with determination. He didn't waste time with pleasantries or small talk. He laid out the journal on a heavy oak table that had probably witnessed 1,000 similar revelations, pointed to the coded signals he'd transcribed with painstaking care, and told her everything he suspected about Thorne's operation and his grandfather's true fate. His words came in a rush, the pent-up frustration and anger of decades finally finding voice. Ilara listened intently, her brow furrowed in concentration, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed her sharp intellect and deep knowledge of local affairs. She recognized the pattern in the numbers not as a traditional radio code, but as something more mundane, yet sinister. Shipping manifests, delivery schedules, and location coordinates that spoke of a sophisticated smuggling operation. Together, they delved into the town archives like archaeologists uncovering a buried civilization. Ilara, with her encyclopedic knowledge of local history and her librarian's instinct for connecting disparate pieces of information, pulled out old geological surveys and property maps, mining records and archaeological reports, cross-referencing them with the dates and frequencies carefully recorded in Arthur's journal. Caleb, using his analytical skills honed by years of intelligence work in hostile territories, began to see the hidden logic in what had seemed like random numbers floating in the electronic ether. The signal wasn't just one message repeated endlessly. It was a network, a sophisticated communication system coordinating a schedule of movements through the vast, untamed wilderness of the surrounding national forest. It was a logistical operation hidden in plain sight, using the cover of legitimate business to mask something far more sinister. After hours of painstaking work, that left their eyes strained and their backs aching. They made the connection that changed everything. The coordinates embedded in the transmissions pointed to a series of remote, difficult-to-access locations, all on federally protected land where unauthorized excavation was a federal crime. All near sites flagged in Arthur's meticulous notes for their historical significance and archaeological value. The truth was undeniable and horrifying in its scope. Thorne wasn't just a successful local businessman with flexible ethics. He was running a sophisticated smuggling operation, using his logistics company and his network of legitimate businesses as a front to plunder the very artifacts he and Arthur had once sworn to protect. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a crime against history itself. A systematic looting that had been going on for decades under the noses of federal authorities and local law enforcement. Thorne did not wait long to escalate the conflict, demonstrating the patience of a predator who had already selected his prey. The morning after Caleb's revealing meeting with Alara, he drove down to the town's only bank, needing cash for supplies and fuel. He tried to withdraw money from the ATM, a routine transaction he'd performed countless times, but was met with a stark, cold message that made his blood turn to ice. Card declined. Contact your financial institution immediately. The words blinked at him from the screen like an electronic death sentence. A quick call to his bank's customer service line confirmed his darkest fears. His account had been frozen due to a fraud investigation, a flag raised by what the representative described as credible information from a concerned third party, suggesting unusual activity. The bank representative was polite, but inflexible, explaining that the matter would need to be resolved through their fraud department, a process that could take weeks or even months. The move was surgical, impersonal, and devastatingly effective, cutting off his access to his own money with the clinical precision of a financial assassin. It was, he realized with growing anger, the exact same tactic Thorne had used to financially cripple his grandfather decades ago. A cold-blooded play designed to isolate him and leave him stranded without resources to fight back. Arthur's journal had mentioned similar mysterious financial difficulties that had appeared just as he began asking uncomfortable questions about his former friend's activities. History was repeating itself with ruthless efficiency. Caleb felt a surge of defiant anger rise in his chest, a military man's refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. He would not be broken so easily, would not be driven from his grandfather's land by financial manipulation and corporate bullying. But Thorne, it seemed, had anticipated his resilience and had prepared additional weapons to deploy in their shadow war. That night, as the storm returned with renewed fury, howling down from the high peaks like all the demons of winter unleashed at once, a sharp metallic snap echoed from outside, loud enough to cut through the wind's banshee wail and the rattle of the old cabin's windows. The sound was wrong, foreign to the natural symphony of the mountain night, and it sent an immediate chill of alarm down Caleb's spine. Sarge shot up from his sleeping place beside the wood stove, barking frantically toward the base of the tower, his alarm calls echoing off the canyon walls. Something was very wrong. Caleb grabbed his heavy maglite and his hunting rifle, checking the chamber out of habit, and stepped out into the blizzard that was doing its best to bury the world in white. The cold hit him like a physical blow, the wind driving snow into his face with stinging force, but he pressed forward, following Sarge toward the tower's base. The beam of his flashlight cut through the swirling snow like a sword through silk, landing on the thick coaxial cable that ran from the control station up to the main antenna array high above. His heart sank as he saw what Thorne's people had done. The cable had been severed cleanly, cut through with what looked like industrial bolt cutters, the metal ends gleaming in the harsh white light like fresh wounds. This was no accident. No random act of vandalism by bored teenagers or disgruntled locals. This was a message, delivered with the precision of a military operation. The thick cable represented his grandfather's connection to the outside world, his ability to monitor and record Thorne's criminal communications, and now it lay in the snow like a severed lifeline. This was no longer about financial pressure or psychological intimidation games designed to wear him down gradually. This was a direct physical attack on his ability to gather evidence and call for help. Thorne had escalated from economic warfare to direct action, showing that he was willing to move beyond subtle manipulation to outright sabotage. The message was crystal clear, delivered not in words, but in twisted metal and severed connections. Stop digging into the past. Stop listening to what you shouldn't hear. Stop being a threat to carefully laid plans decades in the making. The sabotage of his communication lifeline left Caleb with no choice but to take the fight directly to his enemy's territory. He couldn't wait for Thorne to make the next move, couldn't allow himself to be picked apart piece by piece like his grandfather had been. The coordinates from the decoded transmissions burned in his memory, and he knew that somewhere in those remote mountain locations lay the evidence that could expose decades of criminal activity. With the storm finally beginning to subside, leaving the world wrapped in a crystalline blanket of fresh snow, Caleb made his preparations for what might be the most dangerous journey of his life. He packed his military surplus gear with the methodical precision of a soldier preparing for combat. Survival rations that could sustain him for days, a first aid kit stocked with battlefield medical supplies, waterproof matches, emergency blankets, climbing rope, and his grandfather's detailed topographical maps marked with cryptic notations that now made perfect sense. His hunting rifle went into a weather-resistant case, along with enough ammunition to handle whatever dangers might await in the wilderness. Sarge watched these preparations with intelligent eyes, sensing the gravity of what was to come, his tail wagging with anticipation rather than fear. The dog had been bred for work, for partnership with humans in challenging environments, and every instinct told him that this was what they had been training for during their quiet months on the mountain. As dawn broke over the peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink, Caleb and Sarge set out on their snowshoes, following a barely visible trail that wound deeper into the national forest than most hikers ever ventured. The first coordinates led them toward a series of hanging valleys, accessible only by traversing steep, avalanche-prone slopes that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. The silence of the high country was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the pines and the rhythmic crunch of their snowshoes on the packed snow. Sarge ranged ahead, his dark coat stark against the white landscape, occasionally pausing to test the air or investigate interesting scents that spoke to his canine understanding of the mountain's secrets. The trail grew treacherous as they climbed higher, following ancient game paths that switched back and forth across increasingly steep terrain. Caleb's military training served him well, his body remembering the lessons of endurance and mental toughness learned in harsh environments around the world. But this was different. This was personal. Every step carried him deeper into his grandfather's world, into the landscape that Arthur had explored with his former best friend before betrayal had poisoned everything between them. The higher they climbed, the more evidence Caleb found of recent human activity. Boot prints in sheltered areas where the snow hadn't completely covered them. Broken branches at heights that suggested the passage of heavily loaded pack animals. And most tellingly, the occasional glint of metal debris that had no business being in pristine wilderness. They were following a supply route, he realized, a carefully planned pathway that allowed heavy equipment and stolen artifacts to be moved through terrain that should have been impossible to navigate with anything larger than a backpack. Thorne's operation was far more sophisticated than he had imagined, involving not just local criminals, but a network of people with serious mountaineering skills and expensive equipment. As they crested a particularly challenging ridge, Sarge suddenly froze, his ears pricked forward and his body rigid with attention. Caleb immediately dropped to a crouch, his rifle sliding smoothly into his hands as his combat instincts took over. Through the sparse trees ahead, he could make out the geometric lines of human construction, artificial angles that had no place in the organic curves of the natural world. It was a shelter, camouflaged with military precision and nearly invisible from any angle except the one they were approaching from. Smoke rose from a carefully concealed chimney, and the sound of voices carried on the thin mountain air. They had found the first way station in Thorne's smuggling network, and it was currently occupied. Using hand signals that Sarge had learned through months of training, Caleb directed his companion to circle around to the left while he approached from the right, creating a classic flanking maneuver that would give them multiple escape routes if things went wrong. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from a distance, built into the natural contours of the mountainside, with the kind of careful engineering that spoke of significant investment and long-term planning. Solar panels glinted on the partially exposed roof, and a sophisticated radio antenna stretched between two tall pines, explaining how this remote outpost maintained communication with the outside world. Through a partially fogged window, Caleb could see the warm glow of electric lights and the shadowy figures of at least 3 men. His heart pounded as he maneuvered closer, every sense hyper-alert for signs of discovery. The voices became clearer as he approached, rough masculine tones discussing schedules and deliveries with the casual efficiency of men who had done this many times before. One voice, younger and nervous, was asking about the old man's grandson and whether they should be worried about him poking around the mountain. An older, more authoritative voice dismissed the concern with cruel laughter, suggesting that Caleb would soon be joining his grandfather in whatever remote grave they had dug for Arthur's inconvenient questions. The casual mention of his grandfather's murder hit Caleb like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears and flooding his system with a cold rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical judgment. These weren't just smugglers and thieves. They were killers who had eliminated Arthur when he became too dangerous to their operation, and they were planning to do the same to him. Through the window, Caleb could see detailed maps covering one wall, marked with routes and timing notations that revealed the full scope of Thorne's criminal enterprise. Wooden crates stacked in the corners bore the kind of official-looking shipping labels that would allow them to pass through customs without inspection, while artifacts that clearly belonged in museums lay scattered on tables like common loot. Ancient pottery, carved stone tools, and what appeared to be sections of petroglyphs carefully chiseled from cave walls provided silent testimony to decades of systematic plundering. A sophisticated radio setup dominated one corner of the room, its multiple antennas and frequency displays making it clear that this was the nerve center for coordinating the movement of stolen goods across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. The operation was vast, professional, and had been running for far longer than Caleb had imagined. As he watched, one man moved to the radio and began transmitting a coded message, using the same format that Caleb had intercepted at his grandfather's tower. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just a local crime syndicate. It was an international smuggling ring that had been systematically looting some of America's most precious archaeological sites for decades, using the cover of Thorne's legitimate businesses to move stolen artifacts to private collectors and foreign buyers who cared nothing for the cultural heritage they were destroying. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, not just of Arthur's friendship, but of the nation's trust and the sacred heritage of the indigenous peoples who had called these mountains home for thousands of years before the first European settlers arrived. Caleb knew he needed photographs, recordings, anything that could serve as evidence in a court of law, but as he maneuvered to get a better angle with his phone's camera, disaster struck. A loose rock, disturbed by his careful movement, clattered down the slope with a sound that seemed to echo off every peak for miles around. The conversation inside the cabin stopped instantly, replaced by the kind of deadly silence that preceded violence. Sarge, responding to some signal Caleb hadn't consciously given, immediately began barking furiously from his position on the far side of the clearing, drawing the occupants' attention away from Caleb's hiding spot. The cabin door burst open, and 3 armed men spilled out into the snow, their weapons already drawn and their eyes scanning the tree line with the practiced wariness of men who had killed before and would not hesitate to kill again. The youngest of them, a nervous-looking man with the soft build of someone more accustomed to office work than mountain survival, pointed toward Sarge's position and shouted something about the damn dog. The leader, a grizzled veteran of some forgotten conflict whose scarred face spoke of violence as a way of life, motioned for silence and began directing his men with military precision. They spread out in a search pattern that would systematically sweep the area, cutting off escape routes and driving their quarry into a killing zone. Caleb found himself caught between his position behind the cabin and the armed men who were now actively hunting him, with only Sarge's continued distraction keeping him from immediate discovery. The situation deteriorated rapidly as the leader, clearly the most experienced of the 3, began reading the signs in the snow with the skill of a professional tracker. Boot prints, disturbed vegetation, and the telltale marks of snowshoes painted a clear picture of Caleb's approach route and current position. With cold professionalism, the man began directing his companions to flank around while he maintained overwatch, a tactical deployment that would trap Caleb in a crossfire with no chance of escape. The nervous man, revealed through their shouted communications to be Liam, one of Thorne's direct employees, kept glancing back at the cabin as if eager to return to its warmth and safety. But the leader's harsh commands kept him moving through the snow, despite his obvious discomfort with the mountain environment. Caleb realized that his only chance lay in action, rather than concealment, in using the temporary confusion created by Sarge's barking to level the playing field before his enemies could complete their encirclement. Drawing on every lesson learned in hostile territories, he made his move with the explosive speed that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. His rifle came up smoothly, the scope finding its target with the automatic precision of countless hours of training, and his first shot took the leader center mass, dropping him into the snow with the finality of a falling tree. The crack of the rifle shot echoed off the surrounding peaks like thunder, its violence shocking in the pristine silence of the high country, and for a moment the remaining 2 men froze in confusion and terror. Liam, his soft office worker's reflexes no match for the sudden eruption of violence, stood paralyzed with his weapon lowered, his mouth hanging open in shock at the sight of his leader's blood spreading across the white snow. The 3rd man, showing more combat experience, immediately dove for cover behind a fallen log and began returning fire, his shot splintering the tree bark inches from Caleb's head and filling the air with the sharp smell of cordite and pine sap. The firefight was brief but intense, a deadly game of cat and mouse played out across the snowy clearing with life and death hanging in the balance. Caleb used every piece of available cover, moving between trees and rocks with the fluid grace of a predator, while his remaining opponent proved to be a worthy adversary with good tactical instincts and excellent marksmanship skills. Bullets whined through the air between them, each shot a potential death sentence, while Sarge continued his diversionary tactics from the opposite side of the clearing, his barking and movement forcing the enemy to divide his attention between multiple threats. The turning point came when Liam, panicking under the stress of his first real gunfight, broke cover and ran toward the cabin in search of better weapons or reinforcements. Caleb's shot caught him in the leg, sending him tumbling into the snow with a scream of pain and fear that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. With his companion down and bleeding, the 3rd man's nerve finally broke, and he attempted to retreat deeper into the forest, abandoning his wounded colleague and his duty to protect Thorne's operation. Caleb let him go, more interested in securing the evidence in the cabin than in pursuing a fleeing enemy through terrain that favored the defender. As the sound of crashing brush faded into the distance, an unnatural quiet settled over the clearing, broken only by Liam's moans of pain and the whisper of wind through the pines. The first battle in their private war was over, but Caleb knew that more dangerous confrontations lay ahead. The victory at the cabin proved to be short-lived as the distant rumble of approaching vehicles echoed through the mountain valleys, their engines straining against the steep terrain with mechanical determination. Caleb quickly secured what evidence he could from the cabin, stuffing his pack with photographs of the maps, samples of the stolen artifacts, and most importantly, the radio equipment's frequency logs that would prove the connection to his grandfather's intercepted transmissions. But time was running out faster than he had anticipated. Through the cabin's radio, which continued to crackle with coded communications, he heard the chilling news that a much larger force was converging on their position. Thorn himself was leading a convoy of armed men up the mountain, using the same supply routes that had allowed the smuggling operation to flourish for decades. The betrayer who had destroyed Arthur's life was coming to finish what he had started, to eliminate the last witness to his crimes and bury the truth as deep as he had buried Caleb's grandfather. Sarge appeared at Caleb's side, his intelligent eyes reflecting the urgency of their situation, and together they gathered their gear and prepared to abandon their temporary sanctuary. The wounded Liam, still conscious despite his injury, looked up at Caleb with a mixture of fear and hatred, his soft features twisted by pain and the knowledge that his comfortable life as one of Thorn's lieutenants was about to end in these frozen mountains. Caleb felt no pity for the man who had casually discussed his grandfather's murder, but he wasn't a killer by nature, and he left Liam with basic first aid supplies and instructions to surrender when Thorn's people arrived. The higher ground beckoned, offering both escape and the tactical advantage that Caleb's military training told him he would need in the confrontation that was now inevitable. They climbed higher into the alpine zone, where the trees grew sparse and twisted, their gnarled forms sculpted by decades of harsh winds and killing cold. The terrain here was unforgiving, a landscape of exposed rock faces, hidden crevasses, and sudden drop-offs that could kill the unwary with a single misstep. But it was also the kind of environment where a skilled soldier could turn the mountains themselves into allies, using the natural fortifications and deadly beauty of the high country to even the odds against superior numbers. Caleb's breath formed clouds in the thin air as they climbed, his lungs working harder to extract oxygen from the increasingly sparse atmosphere. But his body remembered the lessons of high-altitude operations and adapted with the resilience that had kept him alive in Afghanistan's hostile peaks. Sarge moved beside him with the sure-footed grace of his wolf ancestors, his thick coat providing natural insulation against the killing cold that would stop a less hardy animal in its tracks. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer, the mechanical roar of snowmobiles and all-terrain vehicles pushing up the mountain with relentless determination. Thorn's resources seemed endless, his network of corrupt officials and hired guns apparently deeper than Caleb had imagined possible. The realization that he was facing not just a criminal enterprise, but a conspiracy that might reach into the highest levels of local law enforcement filled him with a cold determination that burned hotter than any fire. This wasn't just about avenging his grandfather anymore. It was about stopping a cancer that had been eating at the heart of everything Arthur had tried to protect. The pursuit led them into a maze of natural rock formations, a geological wonderland where eons of wind and water had carved impossible shapes from the living stone. Ancient cave systems honeycombed the mountainside, their dark mouths yawning like hungry throats in the pale afternoon light. Caleb recognized this area from his grandfather's maps, marked with notations about the sacred places and warnings about disturbing what should remain hidden. These were the caves where Arthur and Thorn had made their original discovery, the archaeological treasures that had transformed friendship into bitter enmity and set in motion decades of crime and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on Caleb that their final confrontation would take place in the very location where it had all begun, where two young men's dreams of protecting the past had been corrupted by greed and ambition. As they approached the largest cave entrance, a natural cathedral carved from limestone and granite, Sarge suddenly stopped and growled, his hackles rising as he detected something that human senses couldn't perceive. The sound of engines was much closer now, and voices carried on the wind with the harsh urgency of men who had come to kill. Caleb made his decision with the split-second timing that separated survivors from casualties. Instead of continuing higher into terrain where they would be exposed and vulnerable, he led Sarge into the cave system, gambling that his knowledge of the underground passages, gleaned from Arthur's meticulous notes, would give them the advantage they needed to survive what was coming. The cave swallowed them like the mouth of some prehistoric beast, its darkness so complete that Caleb's tactical flashlight seemed pitifully inadequate against the encompassing blackness. The temperature dropped immediately, the cave's interior maintaining a constant chill that spoke of depths beyond human comprehension. Ancient formations hung from the ceiling like stone icicles, and the floor was treacherous with loose rocks and hidden crevasses that could swallow a man without trace. But Arthur's maps proved their worth, guiding them through passages that wound deeper into the mountain's heart, past chambers decorated with petroglyphs that told stories older than recorded history. The indigenous peoples who had created this art were the true owners of these sacred spaces, and their presence seemed to watch from the shadows as Caleb and Sarge made their way through galleries that should have been protected by federal law instead of being pillaged by greedy criminals. The sound of pursuit echoed through the tunnels behind them, distorted by the stone passages into something inhuman and terrifying. Voices bounced off the stone walls, creating a confusion of echoes that made it impossible to determine the exact number of pursuers or their precise locations. But one voice cut through the cacophony with chilling clarity. Marcus Thorne himself, his cultured tones transformed by anger and desperation into something savage and predatory. The cave system opened into a vast underground chamber, a natural cathedral where ancient water had carved impossible spaces from the living rock. Massive columns stretched from floor to ceiling like the pillars of some forgotten temple, and the walls were covered with petroglyphs that told the story of peoples who had considered this place sacred long before the first European had set foot on the continent. It was here, in this place of ancient power and terrible beauty, that Marcus Thorne chose to make his stand. The man who emerged from the tunnel entrance bore little resemblance to the smooth businessman who had visited Caleb's cabin with his false sympathy and predatory offer. Thorne's expensive clothes were torn and dirty, his silver hair disheveled, and his eyes burned with a fury that spoke of a man who had been pushed beyond his carefully maintained facade into the raw hatred that had always lurked beneath. He was not alone. 3 more armed men flanked him, their military bearing and professional equipment marking them as mercenaries rather than local thugs. These were killers who had been brought in to handle what Thorne's usual methods could not accomplish, men who cared nothing for the valley's history or the sacred nature of the place they were preparing to desecrate with violence. Caleb found himself trapped in the chamber's center, caught between the entrance Thorne controlled and the uncertain depths of passages that might lead nowhere or might be his salvation. Sarge pressed close to his side, the dog's warmth a comfort in the cave's chill, both of them understanding that the final confrontation had arrived at last. Thorne's voice echoed off the stone walls with theatrical grandeur, as if he were delivering a soliloquy on some vast stage rather than preparing to commit murder in a sacred cave. "Did you really think you could succeed where your pathetic grandfather failed?" he asked, his words dripping with contempt and decades of accumulated bitterness. Arthur was always too idealistic, too naive to understand that the world belongs to those strong enough to take what they want. He discovered these caves, yes, but he lacked the vision to see their true potential. I tried to make him understand, tried to show him that we could become wealthy beyond imagination by sharing these treasures with collectors who would appreciate them. But he was weak, clinging to romantic notions about preserving the past for future generations who would never understand its value. Thorn began to pace, his movements agitated, his gun wavering but never straying far from Caleb's position. The years of guilt and justification poured out of him like poison from a lanced wound. He threatened to expose everything, to bring in federal agents who would have locked away these treasures in government warehouses where no one could appreciate their beauty. So I did what had to be done. I discredited him, destroyed his reputation, made him a laughingstock so that no one would believe his accusations when he finally made them. And when that wasn't enough, when he kept digging and threatening to contact the FBI with his evidence, I had him silenced permanently. The casual admission of murder hung in the air like smoke, confirming Caleb's worst fears and filling him with a rage so pure it was almost transcendent. You thought you were so clever, playing with his old radio equipment, trying to decode transmissions you were never meant to hear. But you're just as naive as he was, just as unable to see the bigger picture. As Thorn continued his villainous monologue, revealing the full scope of his crimes with the arrogance of a man who believed his victory was assured, Caleb noticed something that filled him with desperate hope. Sarge had been slowly, almost imperceptibly, moving away from his side, using the massive stone columns as cover to circle around behind their captors. The dog's movements were so subtle, so perfectly timed with Thorn's theatrical gesturing, that the mercenaries remained focused on their primary target, while a lethal predator positioned itself for an attack they would never see coming. Caleb forced himself to remain still, to play the role of defeated prisoner, while his canine partner executed a flanking maneuver that would have impressed any military tactician. The tension in the chamber was building like pressure in a boiler, ready to explode into violence at any moment. Thorn raised his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger as he prepared to end the conversation with lethal finality. But his moment of triumph was shattered by Sarge's perfectly timed assault. The German Shepherd erupted from the shadows like an avenging spirit, his powerful jaws clamping down on the wrist of one mercenary, while his weight and momentum sent the man tumbling into the cave wall with bone-crushing force. The careful discipline of Thorn's firing line collapsed instantly as the remaining gunmen spun toward this new threat, their weapons swinging away from Caleb and creating the opening he needed. Years of combat training took over, muscle memory guiding his actions as he rolled behind the nearest column and brought his rifle to bear on targets that were silhouetted against their own flashlight beams, like figures in a shooting gallery. The firefight that erupted in the sacred chamber was brief but apocalyptic, the sound of gunfire magnified and distorted by the stone walls until it seemed like the mountain itself was screaming in pain and rage. Muzzle flashes strobed in the darkness like hellish lightning, illuminating the ancient petroglyphs with scenes of violence that the artists who created them could never have imagined. Caleb moved between the columns with fluid grace, using every piece of cover the cave provided, while his enemies, caught off guard and disoriented by the sudden chaos, fired wildly at shadows and echoes. One mercenary, his arm mangled by Sarge's attack, stumbled through the darkness, clutching a useless weapon, while blood streamed between his fingers. Another, more professional and disciplined, attempted to establish a defensive position behind a natural rock formation, but his carefully chosen position became a tomb when Caleb's superior knowledge of the cave's layout allowed him to flank around and eliminate the threat with clinical precision. The third gunman, panicking in the disorienting environment, made the fatal mistake of retreating toward what he thought was an exit, but was actually a dead-end passage, trapping himself in a natural killing zone where Caleb's rifle found him with mathematical certainty. Through it all, Sarge fought with the primordial fury of his wolf ancestors, his training and intelligence combining with pure predatory instinct to turn him into a weapon more lethal than any firearm. The dog seemed to be everywhere at once, appearing from the shadows to attack and then melting back into the darkness before return fire could find him, disrupting his enemy's formations and creating opportunities for his human partner to exploit. When the last echo of gunfire faded into silence, leaving only the ringing in their ears and the acrid smell of cordite, Caleb found himself standing over Marcus Thorne's crumpled form. The man who had once been his grandfather's best friend lay broken against the base of a massive column, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, his silver hair matted with perspiration and defeat. But he was still alive, still conscious, his eyes burning with a hatred that not even impending death could extinguish. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth as he struggled to speak, his voice a harsh whisper that seemed to emerge from the depths of hell itself. "You think you've won?" he gasped, each word an effort that caused him obvious pain. "You think killing me will bring back your precious grandfather or undo 40 years of progress? I've made millions from these sites, shipped artifacts to private collectors around the world who appreciate their true value more than any government bureaucrat ever could. The network I built will survive my death, will continue to harvest these treasures long after you're forgotten." His laughter was a wet, choking sound that echoed obscenely in the sacred space. "Your grandfather died for nothing, and so will you. My people know you're here. They know what you've done. Even if you escape these caves, you'll never be safe. There's nowhere you can run that my money can't follow." But even as he spoke these threats, Thorne's voice was growing weaker, his breathing more labored, and the light in his eyes was beginning to fade. The man who had betrayed trust, murdered his best friend, and desecrated sacred places was facing the final judgment that no amount of money or influence could postpone. But Thorne's threats proved to be more than the desperate boasting of a dying man. As Caleb and Sarge attempted to navigate their way out of the cave system, using Arthur's maps to find a route that would bring them to safety, the sound of additional vehicles reached them from the world above. Radio chatter echoed through the tunnels, voices coordinating a systematic search that would leave no stone unturned in their hunt for the man who had destroyed Thorne's operation and eliminated its leadership. The scope of the criminal network was larger than Caleb had imagined, its tentacles reaching into law enforcement, local government, and the business community in ways that made him realize he could trust no one in an official capacity. The ancient caves that had once seemed like salvation now felt like a tomb. Their passages a maze designed to confuse and disorient anyone foolish enough to venture into their depths without proper knowledge and equipment. As they moved deeper into the mountain, following passages that seemed to descend toward the Earth's molten core, Caleb began to understand the true meaning of desperation. The weight of stone above them was crushing, both literally and psychologically, and the knowledge that armed men waited at every exit made their situation seem hopeless. But Sarge, faithful as always, pressed close to his side and refused to surrender to despair. His presence a reminder that they were not truly alone in their struggle against overwhelming odds. The cave system's deepest passages led them into chambers that few human beings had ever seen, natural cathedrals carved from living rock by forces that operated on geological timescales. Here, far from the reach of Thorne's searchers, ancient formations created landscapes of impossible beauty, and underground streams provided the sound of running water that spoke of hidden connections to the surface world. It was in one of these deepest chambers that they made the discovery that would change everything. A narrow crevice, barely wide enough for Sarge to squeeze through, exhaled a current of fresh air that could only come from an opening to the outside world. Arthur's maps had hinted at this passage, marking it with cryptic notations about the secret way and the eagle's path. But Caleb had assumed these were merely the romantic fantasies of an old man who spent too much time alone with his thoughts. Now he realized that his grandfather had discovered something far more valuable than archaeological treasures, an escape route that had been carved by water and wind over millions of years, a natural tunnel that would allow them to emerge far from Thorn's searchers and the killing ground the cave entrances had become. The passage was treacherous, requiring them to crawl through spaces barely larger than their bodies, but it represented hope in a situation that had seemed hopeless. Sarge's smaller size and natural agility made him the perfect scout for this underground journey, his keen senses able to detect dangers and obstacles that human perception might miss in the absolute darkness of the deep earth. The journey through the secret passage tested every aspect of their endurance and determination, forcing them to confront fears that were as old as humanity itself. The darkness was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on them with the accumulated mass of the mountain above. The passage twisted and turned through the rock, sometimes opening into chambers large enough to stand in, sometimes narrowing to cracks that required them to remove their equipment and push it ahead of them while they wriggled through spaces that threatened to become their tomb if they made a single wrong move. The sound of their breathing seemed thunderous in the confined space, and more than once Caleb had to fight down panic attacks that threatened to overwhelm his rational mind with primal terror. But Sarge never wavered, never showed fear, his steady presence and quiet confidence providing an anchor for his human partner's sanity. The dog's natural instincts were perfectly suited to this underground world, his ability to navigate by scent and sound, guiding them through passages where human senses failed completely. Hours passed in this subterranean nightmare, time measured not by clocks, but by the burning in their muscles and the growing desperation for clean air and open sky. Just when Caleb began to fear that they had made a fatal mistake, that the passage would lead them deeper into the earth rather than to salvation, Sarge's excited whimpering announced that they had found what they were seeking. A faint current of fresh air, carrying the scents of pine and snow, promised that freedom lay just ahead. They emerged from the mountain's depths like miners escaping a collapsed shaft, blinking in the harsh light of afternoon sun that seemed impossibly bright after the absolute darkness they had endured. The exit was cunningly concealed behind a screen of vegetation and fallen rocks, invisible from more than a few feet away, explaining how it had remained hidden from Thorn's people despite their systematic search of the area. They found themselves in a narrow valley several miles from the main cave complex, far enough from the search teams to be temporarily safe, but close enough to see the smoke rising from multiple locations where Thorn's people had established command posts and staging areas. The scope of the operation arrayed against them was staggering, involving dozens of armed men, multiple vehicles, and what appeared to be sophisticated communications equipment that could coordinate a manhunt across hundreds of square miles of wilderness. But they had achieved the impossible by escaping the trap that should have been their tomb, and in doing so, they had gained precious time to contact the outside authorities who could bring this criminal empire to justice. Caleb's satellite phone, protected in a waterproof case throughout their underground ordeal, showed a weak signal that might be enough to reach the FBI field office whose number Ilara had given him before his journey into the mountains. As he prepared to make the call that would expose decades of criminal activity and bring justice for his grandfather's murder, Sarge sat beside him with the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, his faithful eyes reflecting the snow-covered peaks that had witnessed their triumph over impossible odds. The call to the FBI was brief but devastating in its implications, providing federal agents with precise coordinates for the cave system, detailed descriptions of the stolen artifacts, and most importantly, recorded evidence of Thorn's confession to murder and his admission of running an international smuggling operation. The agent who took the call, Special Agent Sarah Martinez of the Bureau's art crime team, had been investigating rumors of archaeological theft in the region for months without being able to gather sufficient evidence for prosecution. Caleb's eyewitness testimony and the physical evidence he had secured from the smuggler's cabin provided the breakthrough she needed to launch a massive federal operation that would sweep up not just Thorne's immediate associates, but the entire network of corrupt officials and criminal contacts that had made the operation possible. Within hours, helicopters filled the sky above Whispering Peaks, disgorging teams of federal agents who moved through the mountain passes with the efficiency of a military operation. The cave system was secured, the stolen artifacts cataloged as evidence, and the surviving members of Thorne's organization were taken into custody in a series of coordinated raids that stretched across 3 states. Marcus Thorne's body was recovered from the sacred chamber where he had made his last stand, his death marking the end of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for nearly 4 decades. The justice that Arthur had died seeking was finally being served, delivered by federal agents who understood the magnitude of the crimes that had been committed against the nation's cultural heritage and the indigenous peoples whose sacred sites had been desecrated for profit. 6 weeks after the mountain confrontation that had ended Marcus Thorne's criminal empire, the town of Whispering Peaks was slowly coming to terms with the reality of what had been happening in their midst for nearly 4 decades. The federal investigation had exposed a web of corruption that reached into every corner of local society, from the mayor's office to the sheriff's department, from the county clerk who had falsified property records to the bank president who had laundered money through a series of shell corporations. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving not just the theft of priceless archaeological artifacts, but also systematic tax evasion, bribery of federal officials, and the destruction of evidence that could have protected some of America's most significant prehistoric sites. Marcus Thorne's death had been ruled justifiable homicide by a federal review board, but his criminal legacy would take years to fully unravel as investigators traced the movement of stolen artifacts through international smuggling networks that reached from private collectors in Europe to black market dealers in Asia. The artifacts recovered from the cave system and various storage facilities were being cataloged by teams of archaeologists and anthropologists who worked with reverent care to preserve and protect treasures that should never have been disturbed from their original resting places. Most importantly for Caleb, the investigation had completely vindicated his grandfather's reputation. Arthur was no longer remembered as the paranoid hermit who had retreated to his mountain in defeat. Federal agents had found his hidden files, his carefully documented evidence of Thorne's crimes, and his detailed photographs of archaeological sites before they were pillaged by the smuggling operation. Arthur had spent the last 20 years of his life gathering proof of his former friend's betrayal, meticulously building a case that would have brought Thorne to justice if he had lived long enough to present it to authorities who were willing to listen. The town's newspaper, now under new ownership after the previous editor was arrested for accepting bribes to suppress stories about suspicious activities in the mountains, published a front-page retraction of decades of negative coverage about Arthur, acknowledging him as a hero who had died trying to protect the valley's irreplaceable cultural heritage. Caleb had made the decision to remain in Whispering Peaks, transforming his grandfather's isolated radio station into something Arthur would never have imagined but would certainly have approved of: a communication hub for the newly established Whispering Peaks Archaeological Preserve. The federal government, working in partnership with 3 Native American tribes whose ancestors had created the cave art that Thorne had tried to sell to private collectors, had designated the entire mountain region as a protected area where scientific research could proceed under strict oversight and with proper respect for the sacred nature of the sites. The old radio tower, once dismissed as worthless junk by everyone except Arthur, now served as the primary communication link between the preserve's headquarters and the teams of legitimate researchers who were working to understand and protect the archaeological treasures that had been hidden in the mountains for thousands of years. Caleb found deep satisfaction in using his military communications expertise to support scientists whose goals aligned perfectly with his grandfather's vision of preserving the past for future generations, rather than selling it to the highest bidder. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same skills he had used to intercept Thorne's criminal communications were now being employed to coordinate the protection of the very sites that Thorne had tried to exploit. He had also established a small museum in the town, displaying photographs and documents that told the true story of the smuggling operation and honoring both his grandfather's memory and the indigenous peoples whose heritage had been stolen and sold like common merchandise. The museum served as an education center where visitors could learn about the importance of protecting archaeological sites and the devastating impact that artifact theft had on scientific understanding and cultural preservation. The evening sky over whispering peaks painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Caleb sat on the porch of his rebuilt cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands while he watched the sun disappear behind the western peaks. The cabin itself had been expanded and modernized with the compensation money the federal government had provided for his role in exposing the smuggling operation. But it retained the rustic character that had made it a perfect retreat from the complexities of the outside world. Sarge lay at his feet, the German Shepherd's graying muzzle a testament to the passage of time since their underground adventure. But his eyes remained as alert and intelligent as ever. The dog had become something of a celebrity in the valley, recognized by visitors and locals alike as the canine hero whose courage and loyalty had helped bring down a criminal empire that had operated in their midst for decades. Children from the local school often visited the museum specifically to hear stories about Sarge's exploits, and the dog seemed to enjoy the attention even as he maintained his dignified bearing and unwavering devotion to his human partner. The bond between man and dog had deepened through their shared ordeal, forged in the crucible of mortal danger and sealed by mutual trust and respect. Caleb understood now that Sarge was far more than a pet, or even a companion. He was a true partner whose instincts and courage had been essential to their survival and success. The dog's ability to sense danger, to make split-second decisions under pressure, and to act with complete fearlessness when his human needed him most had proven that the bond between humans and dogs was something that transcended simple training or domestication. It was a partnership written into the very DNA of both species, a collaboration that had evolved over thousands of years and was still as relevant today as it had been when the first humans and wolves had joined forces to survive in a hostile world. As Caleb scratched behind Sarge's ears, feeling the familiar comfort of the dog's presence beside him, he reflected on how much their lives had changed since that first night when Sarge had alerted him to the mysterious signals crackling through his grandfather's old radio. The transformation wasn't just personal, it was spiritual and philosophical as well. Caleb had found something in these mountains that he had never expected to discover, a sense of purpose that went beyond his own healing and recovery from the traumas of military service. He had become the guardian of his grandfather's legacy, the protector of sacred spaces, and the bridge between past and present that Arthur had always dreamed of being. The radio equipment still crackled with transmissions, but now they carried the voices of legitimate researchers sharing discoveries and coordinating conservation efforts rather than criminals planning their next theft. The tower that had once been dismissed as junk had become a symbol of hope and preservation, a beacon that guided the work of people who understood that some treasures were too valuable to be bought or sold. Caleb's military experience had found new purpose in protecting these sites from a different kind of enemy: ignorance, greed, and the destructive forces that sought to profit from the destruction of irreplaceable cultural heritage. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would stand at the base of the tower and feel his grandfather's presence in the wind that whistled through the metal framework, and he knew that Arthur's spirit was finally at peace. The betrayal that had poisoned the last decades of his grandfather's life had been answered with justice, and the sacred places he had died trying to protect were now safe under federal law and tribal oversight. The friendship that had been destroyed by greed and ambition had been replaced by a different kind of partnership. The collaboration between scientific researchers, government agencies, and Native American communities working together to preserve the past for future generations. Looking up at the stars that blazed in the clear mountain sky, Caleb spoke the words that had crystallized in his mind over the months since their underground ordeal. Sometimes, the most important battles are not fought on a field of war, but for the honor of those who came before us, and we are lucky if we don't have to fight them alone. Sarge's tail thumped against the porch boards as if he understood and approved of this sentiment, and together they sat in comfortable silence, guardians of the night and protectors of memories that would outlast them both. What does loyalty mean to you? Share the story of your own loyal companion in the comments below, because in a world that often seems divided by conflict and mistrust, the bonds we form with those who stand beside us through danger and uncertainty remind us of what truly matters. The relationship between Caleb and Sarge demonstrates that courage isn't something we're born with, but something we discover when we have someone worth protecting and someone who will protect us in return. Their story shows us that the most powerful force in the world isn't money or political influence, but the willingness to sacrifice everything for those we love and the principles we believe in. For more stories of courage and unbreakable bonds between veterans and their faithful companions, stories that celebrate the healing power of loyalty and the strength that comes from standing together against impossible odds, make sure to subscribe to our channel. These are the stories that need to be told, the examples of honor and devotion that can inspire us to be better than we thought possible, and to never give up on the people and causes that matter most to us. And don't go anywhere, because the next incredible story is waiting for you on your screen right now. Another tale of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that define us as human beings. Click to continue the journey with us, and thank you for honoring the stories of our veterans and their faithful companions who serve alongside them with hearts full of courage and souls that know the true meaning of devotion. Together, we remember that the greatest battles are often fought not for territory or treasure, but for the honor of those who came before us and the protection of those who will come after.